The Galactic Council chamber stretched for kilometers in every direction, its crystalline walls reflecting the bioluminescent glow of 1,000 different alien species. Representatives from across the galaxy had gathered for what many considered the most important trial in recorded history. The charges were simple. Humanity stood accused of war crimes against the Zephyrian Empire, and the punishment, if found guilty, would be complete extinction. Admiral Kextar of the Zephyrian Empire stood at the prosecutor's podium, his scaled hide glistening under the chamber's artificial suns. Standing 3 meters tall, with razor-sharp claws and teeth like obsidian daggers, he was the epitome of Zephyrian superiority. His species had conquered 47 star systems in the past century alone, and they had never met a species they couldn't dominate through sheer force. Honored council members, Kextar began, his voice carrying the authority of 1,000 victories. We stand before you today to seek justice against the most barbaric species the galaxy has ever known. These humans have committed atrocities that shake the very foundations of civilized space. The council members shifted in their seats, some nodding in agreement. The Crystalline Collective's representative, a being of pure, living mineral, chimed in harmonious tones of approval. The hive mind speaker, a massive insectoid creature, clicked its mandibles in what passed for agreement among its kind. Even the peaceful, ethereal monks, floating beings of pure energy, pulsed with concern. Kextar activated a holographic display that filled the chamber's center. Images of devastated Zephyrian outposts flickered to life, showing twisted metal and scorched earth. These humans destroyed 17 of our mining colonies in the Outer Rim. Not content with simple victory, they hunted down our civilians, our children, showing no mercy to the innocent. The evidence was damning. Video footage showed human soldiers in their primitive ballistic armor, wielding projectile weapons that seemed laughably outdated compared to Zephyrian plasma technology. Yet somehow, these backward creatures had managed to defeat the Empire's finest warriors. But what disturbs us most, Kextar continued, his yellow eyes gleaming with righteous anger, is their complete disregard for the accepted rules of warfare. They refused to surrender when faced with superior numbers. They employed tactics so brutal, so savage, that our veterans refuse to speak of them. Some of our greatest warriors now require psychological treatment just from witnessing human combat methods. A murmur rippled through the chamber. The Zephyrians were known throughout the galaxy for their military prowess. The idea that humans could traumatize Zephyrian soldiers was almost unthinkable. We offer into evidence, Kextar said, gesturing to another section of his presentation, communications intercepted from human command during these engagements. Listen to how they speak of war, how they embrace violence as if it were natural to them. The chamber filled with audio recordings of human military communications. Voices speaking in the harsh, guttural language of Earth echoed through the space. Alpha Team, we've got movement on the ridge. Looks like a full company of lizards heading our way. Copy that, Bravo Leader. Remember, these things bleed, just like anything else. Make every shot count. Roger. Time to show them what humans do best. The casual way the humans spoke of killing, their matter-of-fact approach to violence, sent chills through many council members. This was not the language of civilized beings defending themselves. This sounded like predators discussing their hunt. Kextar smiled, showing rows of sharp teeth. As you can hear, these creatures revel in bloodshed. They call us lizards with derision, reducing our proud species to mere animals in their eyes. This is not the behavior of a species worthy of membership in galactic civilization. The hologram shifted to show tactical analyses of the human victories. Despite being outnumbered 3-1 in every engagement, despite having inferior technology, the humans had not only won, but had done so with minimal losses to their own forces. Their tactics are completely alien to civilized warfare, Kextar explained. They use something they call psychological warfare, deliberately terrorizing their enemies. They leave false retreats to lure our forces into traps. They fight at night when no honorable species would engage in combat. They hide in the ground like insects, striking from concealment rather than facing their enemies with honor. The Council's reaction was mixed. Some species valued honor in combat above all else and found the human methods distasteful. Others, particularly those who had faced the Zephyrian Empire's expansion, seemed more interested in the fact that someone had finally managed to defeat the seemingly unstoppable war machine. But perhaps most disturbing of all, Kextar continued, his voice dropping to a more ominous tone, is what our intelligence suggests about their true capabilities. The forces we faced in the Outer Rim were not even their primary military units. According to our sources, these were merely their colonial defense forces, essentially civilian militia with minimal training and obsolete equipment. This statement sent a wave of unease through the chamber. If untrained humans with primitive weapons could defeat the Zephyrian Empire's finest, what could their actual military accomplish? We have intercepted communications suggesting that Earth maintains something called a defense fleet that numbers in the hundreds of thousands of vessels. They speak of Marine Corps and special forces units that make the colonial defenders look like children playing with toys. Most terrifyingly, they reference weapons they call planet crackers and discuss something called Operation Prometheus with the casual ease of beings who have grown comfortable with ultimate destruction. The chamber erupted in alarmed chatter. Planet-destroying weapons were theoretical at best for most galactic civilizations. The technology required was so advanced that even the oldest species had only managed to crack small moons, and, even then, only after massive resource investments. Kextar raised his hand for silence. This is why we bring this case before you today. These humans are not just criminals. They're an existential threat to all civilized life in the galaxy. Their very nature is violence incarnate. They must be stopped before they spread their plague of barbarism throughout the stars. The prosecution's case seemed overwhelming. Video evidence, audio recordings, tactical analyses, and intelligence reports all painted humanity as a species of bloodthirsty savages who had somehow stumbled upon devastating military technology. The council members exchanged worried glances, many already seeming convinced that immediate action was necessary. But as Kextar prepared to yield the floor for the council's deliberation, the great doors at the far end of the chamber began to open with a deep, resonating hum. All eyes turned toward the entrance as a small figure walked through, his footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. The human was unremarkable by galactic standards. He stood barely 2 meters tall, his skin a weathered brown that spoke of years under harsh suns. His hair was gray and cropped short in a military style, and he walked with a slight limp that suggested old injuries. He wore no uniform, just a simple gray suit that seemed almost comically plain compared to the elaborate regalia of the other species present. What caught everyone's attention, however, were his eyes. They were blue, pale as winter sky, and they held a quality that made even the fiercest predator species in the chamber unconsciously step back. They were the eyes of someone who had seen things that would break lesser minds, and had somehow remained sane enough to function. "I am Colonel Marcus Chun, retired," the human said simply, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber despite its quiet tone. "I am here to represent the human species in these proceedings." Kextar's expression shifted from confidence to irritation. The humans were allowed to send a representative, but we expected your diplomats or your lawyers, not some aging soldier. Do you seriously think this is your best response to the charges against your species? The old colonel looked up at the towering Zephyrian admiral, and something that might have been amusement flickered across his weathered features. When he smiled, it was the kind of expression that made veteran warriors reach for weapons they didn't even carry. "No," Chin said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to press against the very air in the chamber. "I'm only the Omen." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ambient sounds of the vast chamber, the hum of life support systems, the whisper of air circulation, the subtle electronic chirps of recording devices, seemed to fade away as every being present tried to process what they had just heard. Colonel Chun walked slowly to the defendant's podium, his footsteps marking time like a countdown. When he reached his position, he turned to face the assembled council, his pale blue eyes sweeping across the representatives of dozens of species. When he spoke again, his voice held the quiet authority of someone who had commanded soldiers in the depths of hell and brought them home alive. "Before we begin," he said, "I think there are some things about humanity that the prosecution may have forgotten to mention." Colonel Chun stood quietly at the defendant's podium, studying the faces of the assembled Galactic Council. The silence stretched for long moments as he seemed to weigh his words carefully. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the measured cadence of someone who had spent decades briefing officers before impossible missions. The prosecution has painted an interesting picture of humanity. He began, his pale blue eyes never leaving Admiral Kextar. We are portrayed as savage barbarians who stumbled upon devastating military technology. I find that characterization incomplete. He gestured to the holographic display that still showed images of the destroyed Zephyrian outposts. These mining colonies that were attacked. Let me provide some context that the prosecution seems to have overlooked. Each of these facilities was built on worlds that already had indigenous populations. The Zephyrians didn't just mine these planets. They strip-mined them, poisoning the atmosphere and rendering them uninhabitable for the native species. A new set of images appeared in the hologram, before and after shots of the contested worlds. The before images showed lush planets teeming with life. The after shots revealed barren wastelands, their surfaces scarred by massive extraction operations. The indigenous populations of these worlds sent distress calls that reached human space 3 years ago. We investigated and found 17 civilizations on the brink of extinction, their biospheres destroyed for the sake of Zephyrian resource extraction. When we requested that the Empire cease these operations and provide environmental restoration, we were told that non-spacefaring species had no rights under galactic law. Admiral Kextar's scales rippled with annoyance. Those primitives had no claim to those worlds. They hadn't even achieved basic spaceflight. By galactic law, uninhabited planets are free for development by any spacefaring civilization. Uninhabited. Chen's voice carried a note of genuine curiosity. Is that what you call worlds with billions of sapient beings? I suppose if you redefine sapient to exclude anyone who can't build starships, it becomes much easier to justify genocide. The word hung in the air like a physical presence. Genocide. The council members shifted uncomfortably. The galactic conventions were very clear on the subject. The intentional extinction of sapient species was the highest crime possible under galactic law. We are not genocidal, Kextar snarled, his composure slipping for the first time. We are developers, bringing civilization to backward worlds. I see. Chen nodded slowly. And the mass graves we found on Kepler, 442b? The ones containing roughly 40 million bodies of the native Qatar people? Those were what exactly? Urban planning. The chamber erupted in shocked murmurs. The Qatar had been known to several council species as peaceful traders, though they had indeed lacked spaceflight capability. The suggestion that they had been systematically exterminated sent waves of alarm through the assembled delegates. Chun continued as if he hadn't just dropped a bombshell. We also found evidence of systematic hunting of the native populations on 7 other worlds. Not for food or defense, but apparently for sport. Zephyrian entertainment videos showing the stalking and killing of sapient beings for amusement. This is preposterous. Kextar Ruwarit. You have no evidence of... Actually, we do. Chen's voice cut through the Zephyrians' protests like a blade. We recovered the videos from your own command ships. Your soldiers were quite proud of their work. They kept detailed records. The holographic display shifted again, showing data files with Zephyrian military emblems. Chen didn't display the actual videos. The content would have been too horrific for many of the council species to witness. But the file headers and metadata were enough to confirm their authenticity. So, when human colonial defense forces engaged Zephyrian military units, we weren't simply attacking mining operations. We were stopping an ongoing genocide. The 17 mining colonies were actually extermination camps with industrial facilities built on top of mass graves. The chamber fell silent except for the sound of several council members conferring in urgent whispers with their advisors. The legal implications were staggering. If the humans could prove genocide, their actions would be classified as humanitarian intervention rather than unprovoked aggression. But let's address the real issue here. Chun continued, his tone becoming more conversational. The prosecution seems concerned about human military capabilities. They've suggested that our colonial defense forces were somehow too effective against Zephyrian troops. I'd like to provide some context for that as well. He gestured, and the display showed personnel records of the human forces involved in the Outer Rim conflicts. The 47th Colonial Defense Regiment was indeed composed primarily of civilians. They were farmers, miners, terraforming engineers, and their families. Their average age was 46 years old. Most had never seen combat before these engagements. This information seemed to disturb the Council even more than the genocide revelations. If civilian humans could devastate professional Zephyrian soldiers, what did that say about human military potential? The prosecution mentioned that these forces used primitive ballistic weapons, Chen noted. This is accurate. The 47th was equipped with chemical propellant firearms that would have been considered obsolete by Earth military standards 200 years ago. They had no energy weapons, no powered armor, no advanced targeting systems. Just basic rifles, explosives, and their training. Admiral Kextar seemed to sense where this was leading. Training means nothing against superior technology and numbers. These humans must have had some advantage we didn't detect. They did, Chen agreed. But not technological. You see, every human who joins a colonial expedition receives basic military training as part of the program. 6 months of combat instruction, tactical awareness, and weapons familiarization. It's standard procedure for frontier settlements where official military support might be days or weeks away. He paused, letting that information sink in. What this means is that every civilian in the 47th had received the same basic military training that we give to our regular soldiers. The difference is in how that training is applied. The hologram showed comparative tactical analyses of human and Zephyrian combat methods. The contrasts were stark. Zephyrian military doctrine is based on overwhelming force and frontal assault, Chen explained. Your soldiers are individually superior to humans in almost every physical category. Stronger, faster, tougher, with better reflexes and sensory capabilities. Your weapons are more advanced, your armor is superior, and your ships are more heavily armed. Kextar straightened, clearly pleased with this assessment. Exactly. Which is why your victories make no sense. They make perfect sense, Chen replied, if you understand human military philosophy. You see, Admiral, you've made the same mistake that many enemies have made throughout our history. You assume that superior individual capability translates to superior military effectiveness. The display showed a series of historical Earth conflicts, images that were carefully selected to show tactical situations rather than graphic violence, but the implications were clear. Humans had a long history of defeating larger, better-equipped forces through superior tactics and strategy. Humans don't fight the way you fight, Chen continued. We don't seek glorious single combat or honorable victory. We fight to win, and we use every advantage available to us. When faced with stronger, faster enemies, we use terrain, deception, and coordinated tactics to eliminate their advantages. You mean you hide and strike from ambush like cowards, Kextar spat. Chen's smile was cold as winter. We call it being smart. When your enemy is stronger than you, you don't fight them on their terms. You change the terms of the fight until their strengths become irrelevant. He gestured to tactical maps showing the outer rim engagements. Your forces advanced in formation, maintaining unit cohesion, following established battle doctrines. Very professional, very predictable. Our farmers and miners had spent months studying your military manuals, learning your standard responses to different situations. The revelation that humans had somehow obtained and analyzed Zephyrian military doctrine sent another wave of concern through the Council. Admiral Kextar looked genuinely shocked. Impossible. Our tactical information is classified at the highest levels. Your tactical information is based on several thousand years of military tradition, Chen corrected. Tradition creates patterns. Patterns can be predicted. Our analysts didn't need your classified manuals. They just needed to study your public military history and extrapolate your likely responses to various scenarios. The display showed probability matrices and tactical prediction models that demonstrated exactly how human strategists had anticipated Zephyrian moves with startling accuracy. So, when your forces deployed in what you considered optimal formation, our civilians were already in position to exploit the weaknesses in that formation. When you responded to contact according to your doctrine, our people were ready for exactly that response. You weren't fighting farmers, Admiral. You were fighting an entire species that has spent millennia perfecting the art of killing things that are stronger than we are. The silence that followed was profound. The implications of what Shun had just revealed were staggering. Humans weren't just naturally violent, they were systematically, scientifically violent. Their entire approach to warfare was based not on honor or strength, but on the cold calculation of how to most efficiently destroy their enemies. The prosecution mentioned psychological warfare, Chun continued, his tone remaining conversational despite the horrific subject matter. They seemed disturbed that we would deliberately attempt to terrorize our enemies. I find this reaction interesting, coming from a species that decorates their military vehicles with the skulls of conquered enemies. Indeed, Zephyrian military tradition included displaying trophies taken from defeated foes. It was considered a mark of honor and prowess. The difference, Chin explained, is purpose. You display trophies to show your past victories. We employ psychological tactics to prevent future battles. It's more efficient to make the enemy surrender or flee than to fight them. Less wasteful of resources, fewer casualties on both sides. You terrify civilized beings into submission, accused a representative from the Crystalline Collective. We demonstrate the consequences of opposing us, Chin corrected. It's actually a more humane approach than simply grinding through enemy forces with superior firepower. When word spread that human forces were active in the Outer Rim, 17 Zephyrian outposts surrendered without firing a shot. That saved thousands of lives on both sides. The revelation that humans had actually been more merciful than necessary was clearly not what the prosecution had expected. Admiral Kextar looked increasingly uncomfortable as his narrative of human savagery crumbled under the weight of context and evidence. But I think we're getting distracted from the real issue, Chun said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. The prosecution seems to believe that what they witnessed in the Outer Rim represents the full extent of human military capability. Admiral Kextar suggested that this was somehow our best effort. He turned to look directly at the Zephyrian commander, and something in his expression made the massive alien take an involuntary step backward. I need to correct that misunderstanding before this council makes any decisions based on incomplete information. Colonel Chun walked slowly to the center of the chamber, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had seen the true face of human warfare and somehow retained his sanity. The prosecution has expressed concern about what they call Operation Prometheus, he began, his pale blue eyes scanning the assembled council members. They seem to think it represents some kind of ultimate human weapon. I suppose in a way, they're correct. Admiral Kextar leaned forward, his scaled features tense with anticipation. After the series of revelations about human capabilities, any mention of their most classified operations sent ripples of alarm through the chamber. Operation Prometheus isn't a weapon, Chen continued. It's a doctrine, a philosophical approach to warfare that we developed after a very painful lesson in our own history. The holographic display shifted to show images from Earth's past, not the sanitized versions typically shared in diplomatic contexts, but real historical footage that captured the brutal reality of human conflict. Wars spanning centuries, weapons of increasing sophistication and lethality, the gradual evolution of tactics and strategy that had shaped human civilization. 600 years ago, Earth faced what we call the Unity Wars, a global conflict that lasted 47 years and killed nearly 2 billion people. By the end, entire continents were uninhabitable, and our species nearly drove itself extinct through sheer efficiency at destruction. The images showed the aftermath of conflicts fought with weapons that made modern galactic standard armaments look primitive by comparison. Cities reduced to glass craters, landscapes poisoned by radiological weapons, populations decimated by biological agents that had been engineered specifically to target human genetics. The lesson we learned from that experience shaped everything that came after, Chen explained. We learned that humans are very, very good at killing. Not just other species, but ourselves. We're so good at it that we nearly ended our own existence by accident. The council members exchanged nervous glances. The idea of a species that could threaten itself with extinction through warfare was almost incomprehensible to most galactic civilizations. Operation Prometheus was our response to that realization, Chun continued. It's named after the mythological figure who gave fire to humanity. The operation's purpose is to ensure that we never again reach a point where human military capability threatens our own survival. The hologram showed organizational charts and command structures that revealed the true scope of human military preparation. What the Council saw was staggering in its complexity and scale. Every human settlement, every colony, every orbital station is part of the Prometheus network. The colonial defense forces that engage your units in the Outer Rim weren't separate militia groups. They were integral components of humanity's total defense strategy. Admiral Kextar studied the displayed information with growing alarm. This suggests a level of military coordination across your entire species. That's not possible. No civilization can maintain that kind of unified command structure across interstellar distances. You're correct, Chin agreed. We don't maintain unified command. We maintain unified doctrine. Every human learns the same basic tactical principles, the same strategic concepts, the same approach to problem solving. When faced with a threat, we don't need centralized coordination. We respond according to shared principles that have been tested and refined over centuries. The implications were terrifying. It meant that humans didn't just have a military, they were military. Every civilian was a potential soldier, every settlement a potential fortress, every industrial facility a potential weapons manufacturer. The farmers and miners who defeated your forces in the Outer Rim weren't acting as independent colonial militias, Chen explained. They were acting as forward reconnaissance elements of a species-wide defense network. Their job wasn't just to protect their own settlements. It was to gather intelligence about potential threats and relay that information to the broader network. The hologram showed communication patterns and data flows that demonstrated exactly how information moved through the human network. Every engagement, every tactical observation, every piece of intelligence was shared across the entire species within hours of being gathered. By the time your forces withdrew from the Outer Rim, Chun said, every human settlement in the galaxy knew exactly how Zephyrian military units operate. They knew your weapons capabilities, your tactical doctrines, your command structures, your logistical requirements, and your psychological profiles. The chamber erupted in alarmed chatter. The idea that a single engagement could compromise an entire species' military secrets was unprecedented in galactic history. But intelligence gathering was only the first phase. Chun continued, his voice cutting through the noise. The second phase involved disseminating countermeasures. Within 6 months of the Outer Rim conflicts, every human settlement had access to weapons and tactics specifically designed to neutralize Zephyrian advantages. The display showed manufacturing facilities and training centers across human space, all producing equipment and developing techniques based on the intelligence gathered from the colonial conflicts. The speed and efficiency of the operation was breathtaking. The third phase involved strategic positioning, Chun said. While the galactic community focused on the Outer Rim conflicts, human ships were quietly establishing positions throughout the galaxy. Not warships, merchant vessels, exploration craft, research stations, all perfectly legitimate under galactic law. A new star map appeared, showing human positions scattered throughout known space. To galactic observers, they would have appeared to be random commercial and scientific outposts. But when viewed as a whole, they form a network of strategic positions that could monitor and potentially interdict military movements across most of the galaxy. The fourth phase, Chun continued, involved what we call strategic preparation. Based on our analysis of galactic civilizations, we identified the most likely threats to human survival and developed specific response protocols for each scenario. This was where the presentation became truly alarming. The humans hadn't just prepared for potential conflicts. They had systematically analyzed every major galactic power and developed detailed plans for defeating each one. For example, Chun said, looking directly at Admiral Kextar, our analysis indicated that the Zephyrian Empire represented the most immediate military threat to human settlements. Your expansion pattern suggested that you would inevitably come into conflict with human colonies within 20 to 30 years. The Admiral's scales rippled with indignation. We had no plans to attack human space. Perhaps not, Chin agreed. But your expansion pattern was placing you in control of key resource-rich systems that our long-term strategic planning identified as necessary for human civilization's continued growth. Conflict was mathematically inevitable. The hologram showed projection models that demonstrated exactly how human and Zephyrian expansion would have led to overlapping territorial claims within a generation. So we developed the Zephyrian Response Protocol, Chen explained. A comprehensive strategy for neutralizing your military capabilities while minimizing casualties on both sides. What followed was a detailed breakdown of human plans for defeating the Zephyrian Empire. The strategies were elegant, efficient, and utterly ruthless. They targeted not just military assets, but the economic and logistical foundations that supported Zephyrian military power. We identified 17 key industrial systems that support your military production, Chen noted. Simultaneous strikes on these targets would reduce your fleet's operational capability by 73% within 6 months. We also identified the communication networks that coordinate your forces and developed methods for disrupting them that would leave your scattered units unable to coordinate effectively. The council members were visibly shaken. The humans hadn't just planned to defeat the Zephyrians. They had planned to cripple their entire civilization's ability to wage war. But military targets were only part of the protocol, Chun continued. We also identified social and political pressure points that could be used to destabilize your empire from within, suppress populations that could be armed and organized, economic systems that could be disrupted, religious and cultural divisions that could be exploited. Admiral Kextar looked genuinely horrified. You're describing the systematic destruction of our entire civilization. No, Chen corrected. We're describing the systematic neutralization of your military threat. Your civilization would survive, but its ability to project force beyond your core systems would be permanently eliminated. The distinction was important, but hardly comforting. The humans had essentially planned to lobotomize an entire galactic superpower. And this is just one protocol, Chen noted. We have similar strategies prepared for every major galactic civilization. The Crystalline Collective, the Hive Mind, the Ethereal Monks, we've analyzed all of you and developed specific plans for neutralizing any threat you might pose. The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. The humans hadn't just prepared for war. They had prepared for every possible war. They had systematically analyzed the entire galactic community and developed strategies for defeating anyone who might threaten them. Now, Chun said, his voice becoming almost conversational, you might be wondering why I'm sharing this information with you. After all, revealing our strategic plans would seem to undermine their effectiveness. He smiled that cold, predatory smile that had made the chamber fall silent when he first arrived. The answer is simple. These protocols represent our minimum response to potential threats. They're what we would do if we wanted to win quickly and efficiently while minimizing casualties on all sides. The silence that followed was absolute. Every being in the chamber was trying to process the implications of what they had just heard. If these comprehensive, terrifying strategies were considered the minimum response, what was the maximum? You see, Chun continued, Operation Prometheus has a second component. We call it the Damocles Protocol. It's designed for scenarios where the survival of the human species is threatened and traditional military solutions are insufficient. The holographic display went dark for a moment, and when it returned, it showed something that made every council member recoil in horror. Star charts showing key systems throughout the galaxy, each marked with symbols that indicated the presence of devices that could only be described as stellar engineering equipment. Over the past 2 centuries, Chen explained, human exploration vessels have visited every major star system in the galaxy. Officially, these were scientific expeditions studying stellar phenomena and conducting routine surveys. His voice took on a tone of quiet pride, mixed with profound sadness. What they actually did was install a network of stellar manipulation devices in strategic star systems throughout the galaxy. These devices are capable of triggering artificial supernovas, collapsing stars into black holes, or destabilizing stellar fusion to create chain reactions that can affect entire sectors. The chamber erupted in panic. The idea of a species possessing the ability to destroy entire solar systems was beyond anything the galactic community had ever conceived. The Damocles Protocol is our final insurance policy, Chun continued, his voice cutting through the chaos. If the human species faces extinction, we have the capability to take most of the galaxy with us. Not out of spite or revenge, but as a final statement that some lines should never be crossed. Admiral Kextar's voice was barely a whisper. You're talking about galactic genocide. We're talking about species survival, Chen corrected. The protocol would only be activated if humanity faced complete extinction. But the galaxy should understand that such an outcome would not be in anyone's best interest. The display showed the potential cascade effects of the Damocles Protocol. If activated, it would destroy approximately 60% of all inhabited systems in the galaxy and render vast regions of space uninhabitable for millions of years. So now you understand the real situation, Chun said, his pale blue eyes sweeping across the assembled council. The forces you encountered in the Outer Rim weren't our best. They were barely our beginning. The protocols I've described aren't our ultimate capabilities. They're just the ones we're willing to discuss in civilized company. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the chamber. Which brings us back to the original question. Admiral Kextar asked if this old soldier was humanity's best response to the charges against us. The silence in the Galactic Council chamber was profound and terrible. Every being present was struggling to process the implications of what Colonel Chun had just revealed. The humans didn't just have the capability to destroy individual enemies. They had the power to end galactic civilization itself. Chun stood quietly at his podium, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, waiting for the chaos in the chamber to subside. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weariness that seemed to echo with the weight of centuries. "I can see that my revelations have disturbed you," he said, his pale blue eyes scanning the assembled delegates. "That was not my intention. I simply wanted to ensure that this council makes its decisions based on complete information rather than the limited perspective provided by the prosecution." Admiral Kextar had fallen silent, his earlier bluster completely deflated. The magnitude of what he had unknowingly provoked was clearly overwhelming his ability to process the situation. "But perhaps I should explain why I'm here, specifically," Chun continued. "Why Earth sent a retired colonel instead of diplomats or military commanders or politicians." He gestured, and the holographic display showed personnel files and service records. Not his own, but those of other humans who might have been expected to represent their species in such proceedings. Ambassador Sarah Chun is my daughter. She's currently overseeing negotiations with 3 potential new trading partners in the Beta Quadrant. Secretary of Defense Michael Rodriguez is coordinating with Allied Defense Command on standardizing equipment protocols. Admiral Jennifer Walsh is commanding the 3rd Fleet in exercises near the Rim. Each name brought up detailed records showing humans in positions of authority and responsibility throughout human space and beyond. These weren't people sitting idle, waiting for galactic politics to determine their fate. General Marcus Thompson, who commanded the Outer Rim response, is currently establishing our newest military academy on Kepler, 438b. Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, our leading expert on xenobiology, is working with researchers from 17 different species on medical cooperation protocols. Captain David Park is leading the exploration of the Andromeda Scout Corridor. The list continued, showing a pattern that gradually became clear to the watching council members. Humanity's best and brightest weren't here because they were busy doing the work of building, exploring, and growing. They were treating the trial as a minor administrative matter rather than an existential threat. "So why did they send me?" Chun asked. "I'm 73 years old. I retired from active service 8 years ago. I spend my time these days teaching military history to cadets and tending a small garden on Luna Base. I'm not a diplomat, not a lawyer, not a politician." He smiled, but there was something deeply unsettling about the expression. "They sent me because I'm a specialist in a very specific field. I study what happens when civilizations make very poor decisions about threatening humanity." The holographic display changed again, showing historical records from Earth's past. Not the sanitized versions typically shared in diplomatic contexts, but the raw, unfiltered reality of human conflict throughout their history. "Before humanity reached the stars, we fought wars against each other for thousands of years," Chun explained. "We refined the art of warfare to a degree that most galactic species find disturbing. We learned how to destroy not just armies, but entire civilizations." The images showed the progression of human military technology and tactics over time. Stone weapons giving way to bronze, bronze to iron, iron to gunpowder, gunpowder to nuclear fission, fission to fusion, fusion to things that had no names because they had been banned from use. "We learned something important during those conflicts," Chun continued. "The most dangerous enemy is not the one who threatens you with superior force. The most dangerous enemy is the one who threatens everything you care about and has nothing left to lose." He gestured to specific historical examples. The Mongol Empire conquered most of the known world because they made it clear that resistance meant the complete destruction of your civilization. The Roman Empire dominated for centuries because they demonstrated that opposing Rome meant facing an enemy that would never stop coming. Nazi Germany nearly destroyed Europe because they convinced their enemies that defeat would mean the end of everything they valued. The parallels to the current situation were becoming uncomfortably clear. In each case, the threatened civilization had to make a choice: accept subjugation or face complete destruction. Most chose survival over pride. Admiral Kextar finally found his voice. "Are you threatening the Galactic Council?" "Not at all," Chen replied. "I'm providing historical context. You see, those human civilizations that I mentioned all shared a common characteristic. They were limited by the technology and geography of their time. Their ability to destroy was constrained by physics and logistics." He paused, letting that observation sink in before continuing. "Modern humanity faces no such constraints. Our ability to project force is limited only by our willingness to use it. And our willingness to use it is directly proportional to the threat we perceive." The holographic display showed current human capabilities in stark, mathematical terms. Fleet strengths, industrial capacity, population distributions, resource availability, technological capabilities. The numbers were staggering. Humanity currently maintains 43 battle fleets, each capable of independently engaging and defeating the combined military forces of most galactic civilizations, Chen noted. "We have industrial capacity distributed across 800 star systems, making our war economy essentially impossible to cripple through conventional means." The data continue to scroll past, each statistic more overwhelming than the last. Human space encompassed thousands of star systems, supported a population measured in trillions, and maintained technological capabilities that in some areas exceeded anything available to the galactic community. "Our research and development programs are currently working on technologies that would make the capabilities I've already described seem primitive by comparison," Chen added. "Dimensional manipulation, temporal engineering, consciousness transfer protocols, and some projects that we haven't even classified yet, because we're not sure what to call them." A new concern was beginning to dawn on the council members. If humanity possessed such overwhelming capabilities, why had they bothered with galactic civilization at all? Why participate in trade agreements, diplomatic protocols, and legal proceedings when they could simply impose their will through force? Chen seemed to read their thoughts. "You're wondering why we're here at all? Why we bother with galactic law and diplomacy when we could simply take whatever we want?" He walked slowly around the defendant's podium, his hands still clasped behind his back. "The answer is simple, though perhaps difficult for some species to understand. We don't want to rule the galaxy. We don't want to conquer civilizations or impose our will on other species. We just want to be left alone to grow and explore and build the future we envision for our children." The hologram shifted to show images of human civilian life across their territory. Cities that blended seamlessly with natural environments, space habitats that looked more like gardens than industrial facilities, research stations where humans and aliens worked together on projects that benefited everyone. "Humanity learned something else during our violent past," Chen explained. "Conquest is expensive. Maintaining an empire requires constant vigilance, endless resources, and the gradual corruption of everything you're trying to protect. The Romans conquered the world and lost their souls in the process. The British Empire spanned the globe and bankrupted itself, maintaining control." He gestured to images of human colonies and settlements that showed a completely different approach to expansion. Instead of imposing control over existing civilizations, humans had focused on finding empty spaces and building new societies from scratch. "We prefer to grow rather than conquer, build rather than take, explore rather than dominate. It's more efficient, more sustainable, and it doesn't require us to become the kind of people we spent centuries learning not to be." The philosophical implications were staggering. Humanity possessed the power of gods, but chose to live like gardeners, carefully tending to their own small corner of the universe rather than imposing their will on everyone else. "But," Chun said, and that single word carried more weight than entire speeches from other representatives, "our preference for peaceful growth should not be mistaken for weakness or naivety. We understand that the galaxy contains civilizations that do not share our values. Civilizations that see our restraint as an opportunity to be exploited." The hologram showed the expansion patterns of various galactic empires over the past several centuries. The Zephyrian Empire's aggressive growth was particularly stark, showing a civilization that expanded through conquest and maintain control through fear. Which brings us to the current situation, Chun said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. The Zephyrian Empire has accused humanity of war crimes for defending indigenous populations against genocide. They demand that the Galactic Council authorize military action against human settlements as punishment for our interference in their expansion. He turned to look directly at Admiral Kextar. What they're really asking is for the galactic community to declare war on humanity on their behalf. They want the Council to legitimize their aggression by framing it as law enforcement. The Admiral's scales rippled with indignation. That is not what we're requesting. We simply want justice for the unprovoked attacks on our facilities. Unprovoked. Chen's voice carried a note of genuine curiosity. Let me show you what provocation looks like from a human perspective. The holographic display changed to show detailed analyses of Zephyrian expansion patterns, military deployments, and resource extraction operations. But these weren't the sanitized reports typically presented in diplomatic contexts. These were the raw intelligence assessments that human strategic planners use to make life and death decisions. Our analysis indicates that the Zephyrian Empire's current expansion trajectory will bring you into direct conflict with human settlements within 18 years, Chen explained. Your resource requirements and territorial ambitions make such conflict mathematically inevitable. The data was presented with the cold precision of an actuarial report, but the implications were terrifying. From humanity's perspective, the Zephyrian Empire was already at war with them. They just hadn't started shooting yet. Furthermore, Chun continued, our intelligence indicates that Zephyrian military planners have already developed preliminary strategies for engaging human forces. Your war colleges have run simulation exercises based on our known capabilities. Your fleet deployments have been adjusted to account for potential human interference in your expansion plans. Admiral Kextar looked genuinely shocked. Those were purely theoretical exercises. Standard military planning. Yes, Chen agreed. Standard military planning for a civilization that intends to go to war. From our perspective, you've already decided to fight us. You're just waiting for the right opportunity. The chamber erupted in alarmed chatter as the implications became clear. If human intelligence was correct, then the Zephyrian Empire had been planning aggressive action against humanity long before the Outer Rim conflicts. The human intervention could be seen as a preemptive strike rather than unprovoked aggression. So we come to the real question before this council, Chun said, his voice cutting through the noise. Not whether humanity is guilty of war crimes, but whether the galactic community wishes to authorize what would essentially amount to a first strike against a civilization that has done nothing more than defend innocence and protect itself from planned aggression. He paused, studying the faces of the council members before delivering his final point. Because if this council decides to authorize military action against humanity, you will be making a decision that cannot be undone. You will be telling my people that galactic civilization considers us an enemy to be destroyed rather than a neighbor to be respected. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Chen had made it clear that humanity would interpret any hostile action as a declaration of total war. And given what they had learned about human capabilities, such a war would not end well for anyone. So I ask you to consider very carefully what you're about to decide, Chen said quietly. Because once you make that choice, there will be no going back. And while humanity prefers peace, we are very, very good at war. The Galactic Council chamber remained silent for what felt like an eternity. The weight of Colonel Chen's words hung in the air like a physical presence, pressing down on every being present. The choice before them was no longer about justice or law. It was about the survival of galactic civilization itself. The Speaker of the Council, an ancient being from ethereal monks whose kind had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations, finally broke the silence. Their voice resonated through the chamber in harmonious tones that carried the wisdom of millennia. Colonel Chun, the speaker, said, "Your presentation has been illuminating. However, we must address the fundamental question of accountability. Even if we accept your justifications for human actions in the Outer Rim, the precedent your species is setting is deeply troubling." Chen nodded respectfully. "I understand your concerns, Speaker. May I ask what specific precedent troubles you?" "The precedent of a single species appointing itself as the arbiter of galactic justice," the speaker replied. "You claim to have intervened to prevent genocide, but Who gave humanity the right to make that determination? Who authorized your species to act as judge, jury, and executioner for the actions of galactic civilizations? The question hung in the air, and Chen appeared to consider it carefully before responding. Speaker, may I ask what authority the Galactic Council operates under? The question seemed to surprise the ancient being. We operate under the mandate of our member civilizations, who have agreed to abide by our decisions and accept our jurisdiction. And what happens when a civilization refuses to recognize that jurisdiction? Chen asked. What happens when they commit acts that violate the fundamental principles of civilized behavior, but claim immunity because they never agreed to be bound by galactic law? The speaker's form pulsed with uncertain light. The question struck at the heart of the Council's greatest weakness. Their authority was entirely dependent on voluntary compliance. The Zephyrian Empire is not a member of the Galactic Council, Chen continued. They have repeatedly refused to sign the Galactic Conventions on Species Rights. They claim that their expansion is a matter of internal imperial policy that falls outside Council jurisdiction. So when they began systematically exterminating indigenous populations, who exactly was supposed to stop them? Admiral Kextar interjected angrily. The Empire's internal policies are none of your concern. We have never sought Council membership precisely because we refuse to be bound by the restrictions you place on civilized expansion. Thank you for making my point, Admiral, Chen said. You've just confirmed that the Zephyrian Empire operates outside galactic law when it suits your purposes. You claim immunity from Council authority while demanding Council protection when your actions have consequences. The observation sent murmurs through the chamber. The logical contradiction was clear. The Zephyrians wanted the benefits of galactic civilization without accepting its responsibilities. But let me address the speaker's concern more directly, Chen continued. Humanity didn't appoint itself as the arbiter of galactic justice. We simply acted according to our own laws and moral principles when faced with ongoing genocide. The holographic display showed the human constitution and Bill of Rights, documents that have been refined over centuries of human civilization. Human law requires us to provide aid to sapient beings facing extinction when such aid is within our capability to provide, Chen explained. This isn't a recent addition to our legal code. It's been part of human law for over 300 years. We didn't create this law to justify intervention in galactic affairs. We created it to prevent future occurrences of the mistakes we made in our own past. Images flashed showing historical examples of human intervention in genocides and atrocities on Earth. The pattern was consistent. Humanity had learned through bitter experience that standing by while innocents were slaughtered was a choice that carried its own moral weight. When we received distress calls from the Outer Rim worlds, we faced a legal and moral obligation under our own law, Chen said. We could either act to prevent ongoing genocide or become complicit in it through inaction. There was no middle ground. The speaker considered this argument carefully. But surely you could have brought the matter to the Council's attention rather than taking unilateral action? We did, Chen replied. 18 months before any military action was taken, human diplomatic representatives formally requested Council intervention to stop the extermination of indigenous populations in the Outer Rim. We provided detailed evidence of the atrocities being committed and requested immediate humanitarian relief. The hologram showed diplomatic correspondence and formal requests that had been submitted through proper channels. The documentation was extensive and compelling. The Council's response was to form a committee to study the issue, Chen continued. That committee spent 8 months determining whether the targeted populations qualified as sapient under galactic law. During those 8 months, approximately 43 million indigenous beings were systematically exterminated. The numbers hit the chamber like a physical blow. While the Council had debated definitions and procedures, entire civilizations have been wiped from existence. We then requested emergency intervention based on the committee's findings that the targeted populations did indeed qualify for protection under galactic law, Chen said. The Council voted to send a diplomatic mission to express concern about Zephyrian activities. That diplomatic mission was scheduled to depart 6 months after the vote was taken. The criticism was devastating but undeniable. The Council's response to ongoing genocide had been bureaucratic procedure rather than immediate action. By the time the Council's diplomatic mission was ready to depart, Chen concluded, our intelligence indicated that all indigenous populations in the affected systems would be extinct. We faced a choice between following council procedures and following our conscience. We chose conscience. The silence that followed was profound. The moral position Chun had outlined was unassailable. Humanity had acted because the established authorities had failed to act. They had chosen to save lives rather than follow procedures. But the representative from the Crystalline Collective raised a concern that resonated with many council members. Your actions may have been morally justified, Colonel, but they establish a dangerous precedent. If every species decides to act unilaterally based on their own moral codes, galactic civilization will collapse into chaos. Shin nodded thoughtfully. That's a valid concern. But I would point out that chaos is already here. It's just been institutionalized. The hologram shifted to show patterns of galactic conflict over the past several centuries. The data was sobering. Wars, genocides, conquests, and atrocities have been occurring regularly throughout known space, often with minimal response from the galactic community. The Zephyrian Empire has exterminated at least 12 sapient species in the past 50 years, Chin noted. The hegemony of Vash has enslaved 6 civilizations in the last decade. The Crimson Fleet has been conducting piracy and murder throughout the outer territories for 20 years. The Council's response to these atrocities has been to form committees, hold hearings, and draft strongly worded statements of concern. The pattern was clear and damning. The galactic community had been remarkably effective at documenting atrocities, but remarkably ineffective at stopping them. Humanity's actions in the Outer Rim represent the first time in recent galactic history that genocide has been actively prevented rather than simply condemned after the fact, Chin said. If that sets a precedent for species actually stopping atrocities rather than debating them, I would argue that it's a precedent the galaxy desperately needs. But Admiral Kextar wasn't ready to concede defeat. Even accepting your justifications for the Outer Rim actions, your species has revealed capabilities that threaten every civilization in the galaxy. Your Damocles protocol could destroy entire sectors. How can any species feel safe knowing that humans possess such devastating power? Chen's expression became very serious. Admiral, let me tell you about the last time a human leader had to make the decision to use weapons capable of ending civilizations. The holographic display showed historical records from Earth's past, focusing on the final days of the Unity Wars. The images were stark and terrible. Cities burned to ash, populations fleeing from weapons that could poison entire continents, military leaders facing choices that would determine whether humanity had a future. President Sarah Martinez was 43 years old when she received reports that enemy forces were preparing to deploy engineered pathogens that would make Earth uninhabitable for human life. Chin said. She had 20 minutes to decide whether to authorize the use of weapons that would kill 800 million people, but prevent the extinction of the human species. The chamber was completely silent as the weight of that decision became clear. She chose to authorize the strike, Chun continued. 800 million people died in 37 seconds. The war ended immediately afterward because both sides suddenly understood that they had created weapons too terrible to use. Images showed the aftermath of that decision, not just the immediate devastation, but the psychological trauma that followed. The human species had been forever changed by the realization of what they were capable of. President Martinez spent the last 40 years of her life working to ensure that such a decision would never have to be made again, Chin said. The protocols and safeguards we've built around our most dangerous capabilities are her legacy. The Damocles Protocol exists not because we want to threaten the galaxy, but because we know the terrible weight of making such choices. He turned to address Admiral Kextar directly. You ask how other species can feel safe knowing we possess such power. I would ask how we can feel safe knowing that civilizations like yours exist that would force us to use it. The reversal was subtle, but devastating. Chun had turned the question of human power into a question of galactic responsibility. If other civilizations didn't want to risk triggering humanity's ultimate weapons, perhaps they should avoid creating situations that would force such terrible choices. The Damocles Protocol has never been activated, Chun said. In 2 centuries of human expansion, we have never faced a threat so severe that we considered ending galactic civilization to stop it. But the protocol exists because we learned from our own history that there are some outcomes worse than extinction. The Speaker of the Council seemed to understand the implications. You're saying that humanity would rather destroy the galaxy than allow certain atrocities to continue unchecked. I'm saying that humanity has already faced the choice between survival and conscience once in our history, Chen replied. We chose conscience then, and we would choose conscience again. The galaxy should understand that our restraint is not unlimited, and our patience is not infinite. But even as the moral foundations of the human position became clear, practical concerns remained. The representative from the hive mind spoke in the clicking harmonics of their species. Your capabilities create an imbalance that destabilizes galactic civilization. Other species now face the choice of submitting to human authority or risking complete destruction. Chen shook his head. That's exactly the choice we're trying to avoid creating. Humanity has no desire to rule or dominate other civilizations. We want to be partners in building a better galaxy, not overlords imposing our will through fear. The hologram showed examples of human cooperation with other species, joint research projects, mutual defense agreements, cultural exchanges that had enriched all participants. But partnership requires mutual respect and shared responsibility, Chun continued. It requires all parties to accept that some behaviors are beyond the bounds of civilized conduct. It requires a commitment to protecting the innocent and preventing atrocities. He gestured toward Admiral Kextar. The Zephyrian Empire demands the right to expand without interference, while refusing to accept responsibility for the consequences of that expansion. That's not partnership, that's predation. And predators who threaten innocence will always find themselves facing humanity's fangs. The metaphor was apt and chilling. Humanity wasn't seeking to dominate. They were acting as the galaxy's apex predator, keeping other predators in check through the ever-present threat of overwhelming retaliation. So the choice before this council is simple, Chun said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. You can work with humanity to build a galaxy where genocide is prevented rather than prosecuted after the fact, where atrocities are stopped rather than documented, where the strong protect the weak rather than preying upon them. He paused, his pale blue eyes sweeping across every member of the council, where you can authorize action against humanity and discover what happens when a species with nothing left to lose decides that galactic civilization isn't worth preserving. The choice was stark and terrible, but ultimately clear. The council could accept humanity as a partner in building a more just galaxy, or they could face humanity as an enemy capable of ending galactic civilization entirely. In the end, there was really only one choice they could make. The Speaker of the Council's voice resonated through the chamber with the weight of history. This council finds that the charges against humanity are dismissed. Furthermore, we formally recognize the human intervention in the Outer Rim as a legitimate humanitarian action under the emergency provisions of galactic law. Admiral Kextar's roar of outrage was cut short by the Speaker's next words. However, we also formally censure the Zephyrian Empire for violations of sapient rights and authorize the establishment of monitoring stations in all systems where indigenous populations may be at risk. It was, in its own way, a perfect solution. Humanity was exonerated, the Zephyrians were contained, and the galaxy was put on notice that some lines would not be allowed to be crossed. But, as Colonel Chan walked slowly from the chamber, his work finally complete, every being present understood that they had witnessed more than a trial. They had witnessed the moment when the galaxy's balance of power shifted forever. Humanity had announced its presence not as conquerors or rulers, but as guardians. And like all effective guardians, they had made it clear that their protection came with a price. The galaxy would have to learn to police itself, because the alternative was letting the humans do it for them. And after what they had seen of human methods, most civilizations decided they preferred to handle their own problems. The age of casual atrocity was over. The age of human oversight had begun. And in the depths of space, old soldiers like Marcus Chun smiled their cold smiles and went back to tending their gardens, knowing that sometimes the best way to preserve peace was to demonstrate exactly what war with humanity would cost. After all, they were only the Omen. The real storm was still sleeping, and the galaxy had just learned to pray it never woke up.